walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you, and we fight. We fight like hell. We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women.
Director General Tim Davie and BBC News Chief Executive Deborah Turness have both resigned after a leaked dossier. Associate Editor for the UK Telegraph, Gordon Rayner, broke that explosive story, and I spoke with him earlier. Gordon, thank you so much for your time once again. Can you tell us how these resignations came about? This is big news.
It's very big news. Tim Davie, as you'll know, is the Director General of the BBC. He's effectively the Chief Executive of the BBC. He's the guy in charge. Deborah Turness, who's also quit, she was head of BBC News. So these are two of the absolute top people at the BBC. And it's come after a whole week of reporting by us at the Telegraph of BBC bias, stories about, as you will remember, Donald Trump, the speech that he made on the day of the Capitol riots. That speech was doctored by a Panorama documentary. We had stories about BBC Arabic making everything, framing everything in a very sort of Hamas-led way. And we had some stories about how the BBC's LGBT desk was effectively censoring stories about the transgender debate. It felt as though certainly Tim Davie's position was pretty much untenable from a very early stage, because not only had he been told about that Panorama documentary months ago and did nothing, it was also the culture that he's allowed to exist at the BBC during his 5 years at the top that meant people were getting away with this stuff. They were doing it because they didn't think the management would care, and that's a problem that's very much of his creation.
Gordon, when we spoke last time, the BBC was digging its heels in. So what has happened to shift the momentum on this and to actually force these major resignations?
So I think that there was quite a sort of cynical response by the people at the top of the BBC to our reporting. I think they had very much hoped that it would just go away if they ignored it. They spent a whole week saying absolutely nothing at all. It wasn't really reported by the BBC. But I think what happened was that the story didn't go away. We kept plugging away at it. Other news outlets picked up the story. It was on the front pages of several newspapers over the weekend. You had Donald Trump weighing in and accusing the BBC of purposefully effectively faking that Panorama documentary. And I think that it became obvious to Tim Davie that this wasn't going to go away. He was facing a probable appearance before a parliamentary committee, which would have been very difficult, I think. It could have got very messy. He wouldn't have been able to give any good answers for why all of these things happened under his watch. And I think that there may well have been conversations at a high level within the BBC over the weekend where he was told that the game was up.
You've also published a story about how BBC bosses ignored warnings about woke conduct. Can you explain what happened? Well,
I think for a long time, the BBC has had this sort of inbuilt liberal, left-wing, woke bias. And in fact, when Tim Davie got the job 5 years ago, one of the first things he did was to say that he wasn't going to stand for that anymore. But unfortunately, he didn't execute on the things that he was promising to do. So some examples of that, I mentioned earlier there, the LGBT desk. So the BBC, the way it works, they have a pool of reporters who are used by all their different programs. So any stories about LGBT and particularly transgender issues had to go through this pool of reporters. They clearly had an agenda, as it said in the leaked report that my stories are based on. And whenever a story came up that sort of was against the agenda that they stood for example, anything about, say, puberty blockers or the treatment of children under 18s by gender dysphoria centres, whenever those stories are being covered by other people, they just said, nope, we're not covering those stories. So the only thing that people were seeing, BBC, the audience was seeing, was just overwhelmingly positive stories about transgender, and not a balance at all. And then there were some stories about history as well, where they were doing history documentaries, and they were getting fairly low-level, not very well qualified academics to come on those programs just to say the things they wanted them to say about Britain's colonial past. No balance, not acknowledging things like the Royal Navy's role in ending slavery. That was raised, and the BBC ignored that as well because it just didn't fit with their worldview.
Two final questions. Where to from here? Will there still be an inquiry? And secondly, can we expect any change at all? Or do you think the bias is so inbuilt at the organisation, so systemic, that nothing will really ever change?
Well, I mean, that is the question that the BBC has to answer from here on in, isn't it? So as far as the inquiry goes, I think that Parliament will still carry on with the hearings that they were going to have, because I think they'll recognise that just putting somebody else in the job and leaving them to get on with it probably isn't enough. I think they realise that an external source like Parliament needs to really get to the bottom of what was going on inside the BBC. And then I think the person who takes over from Tim Davie has got an absolutely enormous job in their hands, because there is a temptation to think that the BBC has become ungovernable because of the way that so many people that work there seem to come to work with an agenda. But look, I think if a new person comes in, if they lay down the law from the word go, if they make it clear to people that if they are going to be biased, if they're not going to represent a broad range of views, then they'll be out of a job. And if they actually act on that rather than just talking about it, then look, I think the BBC could get back to the trustworthy, impartial broadcaster that it always has been. But it's going to be a huge job.
Gordon, listening to you speak, you could be saying the same things about the ABC, the taxpayer-funded broadcaster in Australia. It feels ungovernable no matter which managing directors go in. Gordon, the biggest congratulations on your extraordinary reporting, and I look forward to reading where it all goes from here. Well done.
Thank you.